Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Learn Live. My name is Ajith Krishnan. I'm a senior program manager with the data modernization team at Microsoft. My focus is on SQL migration. And with me, I have my co-presenter, Javier. Over to you, Javier.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Ajith. My name is Javier Villegas from Argentina. I work at Mediterranean Shipping Company, and I'm Microsoft MVP in the data platform category. Today, we will be talking about how to migrate SQL Server workloads to Azure Managed Instance. There is a whole learning module that you are more than welcome to scan the QR code and do it. But today the idea is to walk through to some of those steps together so you can have a quick overview on how to start this process, right? So here is the learning module so follow this link and you will be able to start the process by yourself. So let's start. Make sure that you say hi and ask questions in the QA and in the chat when it's available. Let's cover some of the objectives that we have for today's sessions. We will do a brief introduction on what Azure SQL Managed Instance is. Right? We will evaluate some of the scenarios for migration. We will actually see how the migration process works, and we will see how to load and move data in and out managed instance. Right? So let's start with the introduction. Just to put some context to the conversation today, let's briefly mention what Azure SQL is, right? This is actually, I like to call it umbrella, in where Microsoft, covers and group a series of product and services, right? There are two main groups. Which one of them is infrastructure as a service, and the other one is platform as a service, right? Under infrastructure as a service, we have virtual machines running SQL Server, right? This is the same SQL Server version and edition that you've been running since forever, right? The good part of this is that when you deploy these virtual machines in Azure, right, most of the best practices that we've been using in SQL Server that we may have to do by ourselves if we go to, for example, an on-premise environment, are going to be there after the deployment process is complete, right? So we don't have to worry about splitting the log files, the data files, configuring, the location for 10DB, etc., because all this will be part of the wizard when we create the virtual machine, right? As I mentioned, this is infrastructure as a service. So besides taking care of the SQL Server on this virtual machine, we also have to take care of the OS, right? The operating system. We also have to configure the networking, configure high availability, disaster recovery, patching for OS, for SQL, et cetera, et cetera. So these are things that today we are doing in our existing infrastructure. And with that, with this option, we continue doing so, right? Then in the center part of the slide, we have platform as a service. And we have two components, right? One of them, the one at the right side, is Azure SQL Database, right? And the other component is Azure SQL Managed Instance, the one that we will be focusing on today. Both of these components fit into the platform as a service bucket. What is platform as a service? Well, basically, Microsoft will provide us with a SQL Server-like endpoint, right, in where we will be connecting with our tools, right? And we will deploy our databases, we will run our applications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The good part is that The whole infrastructure behind the scene, we don't have to worry about at all. And that is because Microsoft is taking care of all that for us. For example, we don't need to worry about the OS. We don't have to worry about patching in any sense, right? High availability, disaster recovery. It's just a matter of few clicks, right? So these are, the main benefits of platform as a service offering. We will go through that a little bit deeper in a minute. Why we have two components within the platform as a service bucket, Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance? Well, first of all, Azure SQL Database was one of the first services released in Azure, at the beginning of the days when Azure was first released more than 15 years ago, right? This is a single user database in where, we can deploy all our objects, right? Our store procedure, tables, view, triggers, you name it, right? And we can have our application on this. The main, let's say, characteristic for Azure SQL Database is that everything has to live within the same user database. So we won't have the ability to do cross-database queries, cross-database transaction, right? So if you have a store procedure deployed that need to access a table that is on a different user database, we won't be able to do it with Azure SQL Database, right? There are other ways to do it. Additionally, some of the components that we know and we use today, like, for example, the SQL Server agents are not available in Azure SQL Database, right? But then, the concept of platform as a service was really huge, and customers and, community start requesting something more close to SQL Server, right? But with all the power of platform as a service, right? And this is how a few years ago, Microsoft gave us this service called Managed Instance, right? So we will focus on that today, what it is and how to do a migration to one Managed Instance, right? Then there is a fourth component in the slide, which is edge computing, right? Azure SQL Edge, basically with the possibility of deploying SQL Server on an ARM device, like, for example, Raspberry Pi, right? That will help us to, for example, collect and store and process data from, sensors, right? Of course, we won't put our mission critical decision maker workload on this, but definitely it's a good option for edge scenarios, right? So just putting some of the context of, Azure SQL and in particular the focus on Managed Instance, right? So within Managed Instance, we will feel like we are running SQL Server, right? The same product that, again, we've been using forever, but with all the power of platform as a service. The idea is to have a seamless migration process from our existing on-prem environment to a Managed Instance. There are multiple ways to do it. Ajith will cover them later on, right? But just to do a sneak peek, in some cases is as easy as take a backup and do the restore, right? So the Managed Instance is an environment which is hosted as platform as a service with almost 100% compatibility with on-premise SQL Server version, right? Why I say almost 100% and not completely compatible is because there are still a couple of features that are not available in Managed Instance, but most of them are. So if we go through those features, we can say, hey, which are the things that are available in Managed Instance? First of all, we will see that all the security stacks is exactly the same as SQL Server. So if we use transparent data encryption, SQL auditing, row-level security, everything is available in Managed Instance. To do data migration or movement, we can also do, as I said, the native backup and restore operation, right? At the same time, we can also use managed instance to subscribe to a publication with SQL replication. In terms of programmability, T-SQL, right? Everything is exactly the same. We can create temporary tables. We can even use link servers, and we also have the possibility of doing cross-database queries, right? Something that in Azure SQL database is not available. So it's an environment that is really, really comfortable, and again, we will feel like it's exactly the same as in SQL Server. From the operational standpoint, right, we have all the DMVs and extended events offering that we have in the product, query store for performance purposes, SQL Server agent, right? If we need to schedule a task to run, on a scheduled basis, as well as database mail, right? And we can also use other scenarios like, for example, service broker or change data capture, right? So if we go through the main benefits of Azure SQL, both DB and managed instance, right, we will focus on a couple of them that are super important. First of all, business continuity and high availability, right? Imagine all the things that you have to do to set up high availability, disaster recovery, and business continuity in your on-prem environment. It's quite hard to set up, right, in terms of the infrastructure, networking, and all those kind of things, right? Within the PaaS offering, right, we will see that high availability is just right there with managed instance when we deploy one of them, and we see that doing, for example, geo-replication to another Azure region is as simple as a few clicks, right? All the backup strategy, right, which we know that is something super important and in some cases quite hard to achieve and maintain, is also being automated by the service itself. So we can, just rely on the platform to take the backups as well as the retention for those backups. The part that I like the most is scalability, right? So, we can deploy a managed instance quite simply, right? We have it there, but eventually if we need to scale up, meaning adding additional horsepower, CPU, memory, and disk, is super easy, and we can do it on the fly. So if we have to do this in the on-premise environment, that's going to take some time, right? Within any of the Azure SQL services, we will see that this is quite simple. Versionless approach. This is something that is also quite interesting because, we are used to the SQL Server versions, right? I started myself with SQL Server 6.5, right? And then we went through 7, 2000, 2015, and so on and so forth, right? We know that every major SQL Server version, if we have to plan the upgrade or migration, is quite tough, right? So in Azure SQL, there is this concept of versionless. There are no versions, right? So today we have Azure SQL, right? And in several years, we're going to still have Azure SQL, but with no version, right? That's going to give us a really advantage on the upgrade/migration process. That means that the managed instance or the Azure SQL environment that we have today is going to be exactly the same that in several years. Absolutely not. Microsoft is putting all the innovation, all the new features in Azure SQL first, so people can test it like in private preview, public preview extensively, right? And then releasing the feature in Azure SQL first, and then in the future releasing it to the product, right? So super, super cool. So in terms of licensing, there are several options, right? The one that I rely the most is that if you have an existing agreement with Microsoft, you can use your contract to move your licenses to use it in the cloud, and specifically in managed instance in this case, right? You have other options like, for example, pay as you go. You can also have, developer versions of your subscription, so you can, have certain amount of money to start testing on this, right? And there are also another approach, which is the Azure Hybrid benefit, which will allow you, when you are in production with this environment, have replicas for disaster recovery purposes free of charge, right? So there are multiple options in terms of licensing, right? So let's say we are ready to move to manage instance. What do we do? Well, first of all, we have to consider that there are two, what they are named service tier, right? One is general purpose and the other one is business critical. Microsoft tells us that within general purpose, we can run most of the business workloads nowadays, right? But if our workload requires less latency, fast recovery, and additional read-only replicas, well, we have the possibility of using business critical tier, right? As I said, scalability, so we can move from one to the other if we have to. Both of the service tiers are based on the B Core model, right? That means that we will choose the amount of virtual core that we will assign to our managed instance when we deploy it. The big difference here is that general purpose use remote storage and business critical use local storage. And with that, it achieves the lower disk latency, right? So here are some specs related to the hardware underneath the managed instance. We will see how to create one of these in just a few minutes, right? In terms of database compatibility, right, this is super cool because we can bring our SQL Server 2008 databases, our backups, and easily restore them to a managed instance, keeping the original compatibility level, right? So hopefully, after some testing and adjusting your application, you can also move up the compatibility level to, the latest and greatest. But eventually, if you need to do this transitioning just to do the initial lift and shift, keeping your original compatibility level, you can do it with absolutely no problem. So this is a high-level connectivity architecture, right? We will see that when we create the managed instance, there's going to be provide a dedicated subnet, a virtual network specifically for managed instance, right? Behind the scenes, these are 3 replicas synchronizing constantly, right? So we won't see this. We will only have one endpoint to connect. But as I said, internally and replicating by themselves, we will have 3 instances. This is how we can achieve easily high availability, right? And there are multiple ways to connect, right? Initially, we can use, and initially how it was designed, it was only for a private connection, meaning that the only way to connect to a managed instance was either to a VPN connection to Azure or with the express route option, right? Now we have other options that eventually we can even have a public endpoint to connect to a managed instance directly from another Azure services or even internet, right? So another big benefit of the whole Azure SQL stack is that it's deeply integrated with other cloud services, like, for example, Stream Analytics, Azure Analysis Services, Power BI, Synapse, etc. So we can, deploy our whole data platform solution in Azure in where, one of the components can be managed instance, right? Of course, when we move to our transactional environment from on-premise to the cloud, we also have to consider where we will locate our applications, right? Definitely, it's not going to be the same having the applications on-prem than also having a cloud application connected to our database. So that is super important as well. So what do we need to do in order to create one of these, right? How we create a managed instance. We will see that is super easy within the Azure portal, right? Here there are some points that we will be asked for when we create one of these. But why don't we see it by ourselves, right? How we gonna create one of these managed instance and how we can connect to it, right? So first of all, here I have my Azure portal. I will go to Azure SQL, right? And quite simple, I see all the things that I have already deployed. Here at the top, I have the option to create, right? So when I hit create, after a few seconds, we will have, the three main components of Azure SQL, right? The virtual machines, right, with all the combination of operating systems, SQL Server versions and edition, Azure SQL database, and in the center of the screen, we have managed instance. So when we hit create, we will be asked for a few things. Our subscription, we have to specify a resource group, which is a logical grouping of our services. We have to set an instance name. We have to choose in which region we are deploying our managed instance, right? Then here is the part that I like the most, compute and storage. So when we go here, right, we will see that, at the top, we have the service tier, general purpose or business critical. Then we have hardware generation and the number of vCores and storage, right? So we will go through general purpose. We will choose a standard series, right? This is important to mention as well. You won't see in any place a configuration to set up the amount of memory for your managed instance. That means that there is a relationship between the amount of virtual cores for your managed instance and the amount of memory. So for example, for each virtual core, if you choose Gen 5 or standard series, you will have 5.1 gigabyte of memory. But if instead you choose premium series, that relationship per core will be 7 gigs. And if you go to the premium series memory optimized, you will have 13.6 gigabyte of memory per virtual core, right? So from this slider, you would choose the amount of vCores for your managed instance, the total amount of storage in gigabytes, right? Then here you have to select the SQL licensing. In my case, I will use Azure Hybrid Benefit, how you will store the backups, right? And then we go back to the previous screen, authentication method, right? In this case, we can use Azure Active Directory, SQL authentication, or both of them. In my case, I will choose, SQL authentication. And let's put a strong password and repeat it down here. It's going to do the check that everything is in order. We go to the networking part. It's going to create the virtual network for us, right? Here is where we can, decide if we enable or not a public endpoint, right? In this case, I will say yes. And we have three options: Azure Service, Internet, or no access. In my case, I would choose Azure Services, the TLS version. Then we go to security. There are other things to choose. For example, Microsoft SQL Defender, right, which will help us to detect if there is any anomaly in the workload and will give us warnings and notification if there are. Here we will choose the managed instance collation as well as the time zone for our managed instance, right? Let's choose mine in Buenos Aires, right? So finally, we go to tags for grouping and administrative purposes, and the final step is just having here an estimated price. This number is in Argentinian pesos. This is an estimated cost per month. Down here we have, everything to review what we did, right? And eventually, if we want to automate this, because we have to create multiple, we can download the template, right? Super important to consider this message at the top, right? Deploying a managed instance is a long-running process and can take up to 6 hours. There is a new wave that was introduced in November 2022, which basically reduced the amount of time that you need to create one of these managed instances. That is one of the main benefit of that new option. I don't have it enabled in this particular subscription, right? So then we hit create. We won't do it now because definitely we don't have 6 hours. So what I will be doing here is I will connect to the portal to one that I already have deployed. So here we have all the management, dashboarding where we see CPU utilization in the last, days. We see warnings. We see the databases when they were created, when was the last backup, etc., etc., etc. So we can handle it from here. And eventually, if we need to, let's say, change or adjust the compute and the storage, we go here and we add additional, for example, virtual cores or disk, right? Once it is created, I do have here basically a virtual machine with Management Studio in where I am connected to my managed instance, the one that I showed you just before, right? I have these two databases restored there. And as you can see, we have the database section, security, replication, management, the SQL Server agent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Up here, I have a normal SQL Server 2022. The only difference we have here is that in SQL Server, we have the whole always on high availability options, while down here, we don't have it because it doesn't make sense, right? Finally, I just do a select server name and version just to get, how we see it from T-SQL, and this is what we get, right? Microsoft SQL Azure. We don't see SQL Server 2019 or 2022. We only see Microsoft SQL Azure, right? And with that, I just went through the introduction. I will hand over to Ajith to go deeper into the migration process.
Thank you, Javier. I will
stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just start sharing. So again, thank you, Javier, for that great introduction into how you can create a managed instance. So now that we know how it can be created, what the value that managed instance brings in, we've gone through all of that. Let's talk a little bit about how you can actually migrate to the Azure SQL managed instance. Just a quick check, Javier, you're able to see my screen?
I am.
Okay, perfect. So if you go to the Learn module itself, you can actually see the database migration assistant presented as the method to migrate to Azure Migrate to managed instance. While this tool still exists, the new experience that we want to bring to your attention is using the Azure Data Studio. We already have tutorials for this, and the Learn module is also going to be updated. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to show you the newer, simpler method of actually migrating to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now that I've mentioned the Data Studio, let's talk a little bit about the migration tools that we do have now. So to simplify the discovery, planning, assessment, and the migration. We are now centered around three tools for the at volume. When you have a large number of sources that require discovery, we recommend that you use the Azure Migrate Discovery and Assessment. Uh, this basically starts from discovery, which allows you to go enumerate all the resources in your estate and thereon through to the assessment, all the pre-migration steps. With Azure Data Studio, uh, now you basically have a UI-based assessment and migration option. The assessment includes the readiness check, which is something that Javier alluded to, which is basically make sure that there is the databases that you have, the features that you're using will work just fine when you migrate to Azure. And in addition, it'll also give you the sizing information. What size would actually be recommended for the kind of performance usage that I'm seeing on premises, right? Uh, at the same time, we also have PowerShell and CLI as automation options if you want to take a factory approach to both assessment and migration, right? So, and you can see that both the pre-migration and the migration experiences are basically equivalent on the Azure Data Studio and the automation tools. Anything that you can do with Azure Data Studio, you can do with PowerShell and CLI as well. So for today, we will focus on what you can do with Azure Data Studio. So this is the scenario that the learning module presents, that you have a sports clothing company, you're trying to move your databases to Azure. You've decided that you like Azure SQL Managed Instance, now you want to try and execute the migration project, right? So there are going to be three major steps that you perform, actually four. One of them Javier already touched upon, but just to go through them in what would be a chronological order for you. You'd first check to see if there are compatibility issues. So when you migrate to Azure, you don't run into any problems. Then you take performance data and figure out a right-sized Azure resource so that you can create the instance per those recommendations. And finally, you will want to migrate the data over and cut over the application to the Azure instance, right? So let's start with where Azure Studio fits in, right? The Azure Data Studio is basically UI experience for dealing with all sorts of data sources. The Azure SQL migration extension within the Azure Data Studio is the one that helps you with the migration pieces, and that includes the compatibility check, which is basically check the databases to make sure that you won't have any functionality issues when you migrate. It also lets you collect the performance data and generate the recommendations plus the migration experience. And we'll go through this to see how you can do all of this without actually having to leave the Azure Data Studio itself, meaning that you'll have a one screen inline experience to perform all of this. All of the actual migration, sorry, the pre-migration and the migration steps, though the deployment of your resource itself is something that you would do from the Azure portal instead. Okay, so how do we get started? Well, if you don't already have Azure Data Studio, and in many cases you may actually have Azure Data Studio and not realize it. If you've used the SQL Server Management Studio, the same folder where SSMS is installed also has Azure Data Studio. But in any case, you can download it from the AK link that you see here. When you click on that, you're provided a website where you can actually see how to install Azure Data Studio. Let me just quickly take you there. This is what you would expect to see. You can click on the installer and get started from there. I want to point out at this juncture that you don't need Azure Data Studio on the same machine where SQL Server is running. You can install it on another box, so you don't compete with the production's workload that's happening on the server, right? So Azure Data Studio is on a separate machine, maybe even your laptop. As long as you're able to connect from your laptop to the SQL instance, you're just fine. That's basically all that's actually needed. All right. Now that once you follow the steps to download, run the installer, the next step is to basically connect, rather install the Azure SQL migration extension within the Azure Data Studio. As the screenshot here shows you, there's essentially the extensions icon. If you click on that, you'll be taken to the list of extensions. Type in the SQL migration, locate the Azure SQL migration extension, click on install, and once that completes, you can basically then just connect to the SQL instance and go from there, right? How do you assess? Uh, Before I go too deep into this, I just want to say that we will look at all of this as I mean, again, as a demo. I just want to walk you through the entire process so that you are aware of how this works, and then we can go and take a look at actually doing this as a demo, right? So in the Azure Data Studio, everything happens under the context of the SQL instance itself. So you will connect to your SQL server, right click on it, choose to manage, and when the uh, dashboard opens, you will see that there is Azure SQL migration as an option under the in the dashboard, and clicking on that will give you a migrate to Azure SQL button, which will help you get started. Now, when you click on this, if you've actually done this in the past on this particular SQL instance, you might actually be asked whether you want to start a new session or continue with an existing session. If that happens, all you need to do is choose to start a new session so that you can follow along as we go through this, right? The next step um, as you continue to down the Azure Data Studio is you have to select all the databases that you want to assess for migration to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Actually, for migration, let me say that you will see that we will also assess against all the other targets. So you can take a pick after you know what the migration situation is going to be like. Sorry, the assessment and outcome is going to be looking like, right? An additional point to remember is that if you have an application that issues a lot of dynamic queries, in other words, if you use ad hoc SQL statements, you have the ability to generate trace file, an X event trace file, and include that in the assessment so that we can assess those also as we just look at the stored procedures to ensure that there are no feature compatible issues. Now, once you select the databases, there is a brief delay while Azure Data Studio will connect to the SQL instance and run some queries against all the databases, try and understand from the schema what is whether there are any compatibility issues or not, right? And this can take a little bit of time sometimes. You'll see in my demo that I have a small set of databases, so it does not take too long. I didn't want to keep you all waiting as you watch the wheel spinning, but just be aware that when you're doing this on a large instance, it might take a little while for the data to be processed. Now that we have done this, what you would expect to see is something which looks like this. So we have run the assessment. I'm telling you that 6 out of the 8 databases can be migrated to managed instance with no issues. All of them would go to Azure VM, SQL Server on Azure VM if you so choose. And one of the databases is actually ready for SQL database, Azure SQL DB. The others have some feature usages that would not work. Right now, when it says 6 out of 8, so obviously the first question that you have is to try and understand what could actually be preventing the other databases. So just click on the radio button there to choose the specific target, and then click on view or select to look at each database and see what basically was found out as a problem, right? And you can see that the databases where we did discover some points of interest are uh, are listed here as. So there were 2 databases which had an issue. And in this particular case, you can see that clicking on the database will show you what was the actual problem that we discovered. Here, we are seeing that there are a couple of memory optimized tables. And when you take memory optimized tables to Azure SQL Managed Instance, you either need to choose the business critical tier, or if your performance profile actually does not uh, indicate that you might need the business critical tier, you can also reduce cost by basically converting the memory optimized tables to regular tables and using the general purpose table to keep your costs low, right? Once you have decided which are the databases that you would want to migrate, you basically click on select. That returns you uh, to the previous view. But one of the things that we have not yet done is determine what would be the recommended configuration to migrate to. So to do that, there is a Get Azure Recommendation button. When you click on that, you get two options. Um, you can, if you haven't done it before, you can collect some performance data right away. Provide a folder, choose to collect performance data and click start, at which point we will start collecting data. In about 10 minutes, you'll be ready with the first initial recommendation. However, sometimes you may choose to actually leave it running for about a day so that you can capture a wider view of the performance profile on your on-premises SQL Server and use that to size the Azure SQL managed instance, right? There is a second possibility that you have actually captured the performance data using some other means. In fact, the PowerShell or the CLI could be useful to generate that performance data. And if so, you basically just need to mark that you already have the performance data, point it to the folder where you have saved the performance data, and move on to the, basically get the recommendations in terms of what the size should be. So what you can see in the screenshot is that I've been recommended a 4-core 32 GB managed instance. And now that I know what size I need, the next step is obviously to go and create the Azure SQL managed instance. My uh, my co-presenter Javier has already covered this part, so thank you, Javier. It makes it easier for me to talk about the actual migration pieces. So before we step forward, let me also just quickly touch upon what you would do if you had a encrypted databases. So many of you are aware of transparent data encryption, and it is a very commonly used technology which allows you to keep the data in your SQL Server encrypted at rest. So even if somebody were to get access to the data files, there is no way that you can actually decrypt that and retrieve the data stored within the database, right? Uh, However, there is a certificate which is protecting the data. So when you are trying to migrate from on-premises to Azure, you have to take this certificate and uh, register it in the Azure managed instance, so that when you actually do the migration, the database is actually accessible at the destination. The main steps, though we will not be actually looking at that as part of the demo, but the main steps would essentially be to back up the certificate and the private key. You can use that to create a PFX file, and the PVK to PFX executable is useful for that. You convert the PFX file into a base64 encoded string. There is a PowerShell commands that are documented in the learn module. You'll get all the details there, and eventually you will call this commandlet, which allows you to save the TDE certificate to the managed instance with the values that you've created, so that you can move forward and perform the actual migration, right? Cool. So how exactly does Azure Data Studio, or in this case, the Azure SQL migration extension, let you perform or rather help you perform the migration, right? So this, just wanted to quickly touch upon this. You have your SQL Server instance on premises, and you have the Azure SQL targets. This architecture diagram actually refers to all the targets, though today's discussion is primarily around the managed instance. Um, what what's essentially happening is that we rely on the database backups that you're already taking, so that we don't interrupt any of your maintenance tasks, right? Anytime more than one application tries to take a backup of a database, there is the real risk that you'll break the backup chain. So we rely on the existing backups that you're creating. We use uh, so Azure SQL Migration Extension relies on the database migration service to power the whole migration experience. And what happens internally is that there is an ADF pipeline, an Azure Data Factory pipeline that's created, which allows you to basically just install the self-hosted integration runtime with like just a few data points that you need to copy over from your DMS configuration over to create this integration runtime. And once that is done, the integration runtime pulls database backups from your local share, pushes it to the Azure storage account, and the DMS will in turn take the backups that have been stored in the Azure storage account and replay them, or in other words, restore them to the target that you have chosen. Right. This way, there were earlier we had the requirement that you had to figure out a way for DMS to be able to connect into the into the your environment, basically the on-premises environment, to be able to connect to SQL Server and retrieve data. That's no longer required that's not needed anymore. Just having the Azure Data Studio locally and the self-hosted integration runtime is sufficient. So you don't have to punch additional holes in your network just to make this happen, right? This significantly simplifies the initial setup for even, let's say you just want to try this out. You don't have to create a very complex environment for you to be able to try the migration. All right, so onwards, let's see what would happen next. Uh, just to set the stage, you've used Azure Data Studio now to finish the assessment. You have selected the databases, and now you just click next, right? So this is now the third step. And what does that entail? We essentially use the Azure connection information, which is your existing Azure account, the subscription in which you have created the managed instance, the resource group under which it's created, and you pick the managed instance itself. Notice you're not actually entering a connection string in the Azure Data Studio. All of that is being handled for you by the database migration service. So there is no requirement for you to open a public connection endpoint for you to be able to perform the migration. And this means that you don't have to compromise on your security posture just for the sake of moving data to Azure. Next, once you provided this information, we have to set up the database migration service. For the actual migration, you will be asked whether you want to use online migration or offline migration. The advantage with online migration is that if you've got a large amount of data, you can keep moving data over time, and the only time you'll have to interrupt your production work is when the cutover is being performed. Whereas with offline migration, you can basically just, if you're able to stop your application for a little while, it enables you to move at once and reduces the I mean, the complexity of the cutover is reduced by using offline migration. Most customers that I've spoken to and seem to prefer online migration, but your preferences may vary depending upon your own environment. The second question that you're asked is, where have you saved your backups? If you are already leveraging Azure Blob Storage as a target for your backups, you may not actually need to even use the self-hosted integration runtime to copy over the files, right? You already have the backups in Azure. We will just take that and use that to restore. So no problem there. But that's not a requirement. If you have it on premises, we will still help you with it. So, and this demo will walk you through how to do just that, right? Uh, Now, for the Azure Database Migration Service itself, you'll basically provide a location. The subscription will already be populated for you. Just provide the location, pick a resource group and a name for the migration service, and click create. Uh, or if you already have one, pick it from the drop down that you will get, right? Once this is done, let's talk about what it would mean for to actually get started with the migration itself. The first step is obviously that you will want to install the self-hosted integration runtime. Right in Azure Data Studio, you'll find a link which takes you to the download center where you can download the integration runtime. I believe I have it on. So when you choose the language that you want your integration runtime to be at, and you click download, you'll be presented with a few versions of the integration runtime. The recommendation is that you just pick the latest one and click next to download that and install it. Right. All right. So now that you have, once you install the self-hosted integration runtime, by that I mean when you go through the installation process, as the last step, you will be asked to register the integration runtime. On the Azure Data Studio window, you will be presented a couple of keys, right? You pick any one of them. There's a copy button right there. Copy that over, paste it in the integration runtime registration string, and click register, and that's it. The self-hosted integration runtime is now connected to the database migration service, and you no longer need to maintain anything there. Everything is done for you now from within Azure Data Studio. So you, again, back to just using that one tool. All right, let's move forward. Now that you have database migration service set up, you will want to provide the source credentials. These are basically the username and password that you're using to connect to the SQL instance, the source SQL instance, and a username and password that we should use. In this case, I should say the self-hosted integration runtime should use to fetch the backups over from your network share where you're saving the backups. Now, in case you're using for my demo, I'm using a single machine. Self-hosted integration runtime tries to avoid using a network share to connect back to the same server. So there are a couple of extra commands that we need to run to make the to allow that to happen, because we'll have to bypass a security check within SHIR. But we'll touch upon that as we get to it. However, once that's a one-time change, it's not something that you will be doing on a regular basis. But once that is done, in the Azure Data Studio, you can basically provide a network share path for each of the database. Once you provide that and you click next, uh, we basically set up the database migration service to perform the migration, and uh, the, the actual data movement will be done automatically for you. Um, once as your backups are taken, SHIR will copy them over to Azure Storage, and the database migration service will restore them on the target managed instance. Right. You've been doing this for a couple of days, let's say, and you're now ready to actually perform the cutover. So all you need to do is on the migrations tab, and when you do so, you will be taken to the list of databases that are currently being migrated. Right. As you can see, since I don't have any outstanding database backups that need to be restored, I'm seeing ready for cutover as a message. So all I need to do is click on the individual database, click on complete cutover. It'll warn me that I need to make sure that all backups are applied, or if I want to apply a last log backup, as in I stop the incoming connections, I can actually take a tail log backup, which is a final bunch of transactions, copy that over to the network share, wait a little while, that will get applied to the target, and then um, simply click on complete cutover, and that's it, right? The database would be on Azure managed instance. So this was a lot of screenshots that you saw. So let's take a quick look at what it would feel like in the in actuality, right? So here's my Azure Data Studio. Uh, I have the Insiders Edition. There is really no difference. It's except that the Insiders Edition keeps up. I mean, gets updated very frequently. So you'll see very frequently you'll see a pop-up. It says update your Azure Data Studio version. The regular version works just as well. So please feel free to use either. I have connected to my SQL instance. If I were to, let me just go back there. So this is what it would look like when you just land on the page. If you right click and click on manage on the SQL instance, you get the dashboard for that particular SQL Server. As you can see, I have the Azure SQL migration extension already installed. So I click on the Azure SQL migration extension, choose to migrate to Azure SQL, and we are starting a new session. All right. So I have 7 databases. I actually have an 8th one, but that database has been marked offline. So if you see some databases missing from this list, it usually is because the database is currently not accessible. The intent here is to not try and modify something that has been turned offline on purpose by the administrators. Right. So if you find something missing, just go to your SQL instance, bring the database back online, and you will start seeing it here as well. In situations where you have a very large number of databases and you want to select some specific databases, you can also just search for it, right? In my case, I'm just going to choose all of them to move forward. The extended event data that I alluded to is right here. You provide a folder where you have saved all the Excel files, and we'll move to the next phase. this is the point at which it might sometimes take a little extra time depending upon how many databases you're assessing. Mine is relatively small, so this should hopefully not take way too long. After which it will tell me what the what is the readiness for the different targets, right? I've got 4 databases which are ready for managed instance, all fit Azure SQL on Azure VM at this point, and there is one which can be migrated to SQL DB. The others have artifacts which may not work for SQL DB. So again, let's look at why only 4. What happened to the remaining 3? Click on the SQL MI, and let's look at each of the individual databases. I have one database that I can't select, DWQ. Why may that be? When I click on the database itself, I'm provided a list of issues that were identified for that particular database.
Ashit, just a time check. We have 4 minutes ahead.
All right. This should be real quick. All right. So this particular database has got 2 log files, which is what's preventing this from being you'll need to drop one of the log files to be able to migrate to Azure SQL Management instance. For the other 2, the problem is that there are some memory optimized tables, and this is something that we touched upon already. So I select the databases that I can migrate. I want to get the Azure recommendation. I already have the performance data, so I'll just take that from the okay. So the recommendations are being calculated. Once that is ready, in fact, I don't actually need to wait for this. I can once I know that which of the databases I want to migrate, I would be looking at creating the managed instance. I already have one created, so I can move forward even though the configuration is still loading. Let's see. I pick my SQL instance, ES2. Yep, and this is the SQL managed instance I want to connect to. I want online migration. My database backups are on a network share, and at ES2 I have 2 database migration services. I will choose the other one which I know has the SHIR registered. All good. I use these keys to already register my SHIR. Next one, this is where I provide the password for the SQL instance. My database, I also have the storage account already picked because it found that in this location there was only one, so there were no questions to ask. So I have a network share already created for each database with the target database name itself. So I'll just paste this first to every one of them. And oh, sorry, I missed to mention that you need to click on run validation, at which point it will ensure that it has got access to all of these. My validation says my integration runtime connectivity is failed. Oh, okay, I know what happened. My apologies. Right here, just need to provide.
So if you prefer the sheet, maybe we just go to the summary and we close before the session is over.
It sounds good. Let's switch to the summary. So there is a section on how you can keep the data synchronized between on-premises and Azure that we would leave for you to take a look at later. In particular, it uses transaction replication to perform this. So yeah, in summary, we have evaluated we talked about how Azure SQL Managed Instance is useful. What are the features of Azure SQL Managed Instance that are that you should consider? We talked about how you can migrate to Managed Instance easily using Azure Data Studio. There is a link to more resources on the on the deck. The learning session itself, sorry, the learn module itself is available on this AKA link, and that's it from my side. Javier, thank you so much for all your help as well, and I'm looking. I guess I've left very little time, but if there's any questions,
just in time. Thank you, Ajith. Thank you for the audience. It was a great pleasure to be here today. Please follow the Microsoft Learn and the the all the activities that you can do. Do we have questions or something?
All clear, no questions. We took care of that. Thank you.
All right.
Great presentation, and thank you, Javier and Ajith.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great build.